As the sun set over the mall, the lights flickered on and the sound of closing gates echoed throughout the corridors. Sarah, a young sales clerk, had just finished her shift and was making her way towards the exit when she realized that she left her phone in the break room. With a sigh, she turned around and headed back the way she came from. The mall was quiet now, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She walked faster, her heart racing as she passed the empty stores and closed kiosks. As she reached the break room door, she noticed that it was slightly ajar. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was dark, and Sarah fumbled for the light switch. When she finally found it, she realized that she was not alone. Sitting in the corner of the room was a man, his face hidden in the shadows. Who are you? Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly stood up and started walking towards her. Sarah stepped back, feeling the panic rising inside of her. She was just about to turn and run when the man suddenly stopped and pointed towards the door. "Leave," he said in a low voice. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She turned and ran out the room, her heart pounding in her chest. As she sprinted down the hallway, she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't dare to look back, but she knew that whoever it was, they were getting closer. Finally, when she reached the main entrance of the mall and burst through the doors, gasping for air, she looked around, but there was no sign of the man who had chased her. She tried to calm herself down, telling herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, but as she looked around the deserted mall, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The stores were all closed, and there was no sign of any other shoppers or employees. She had never seen the mall so empty before. As she walked towards the parking lot, she realized that her car was parked on the opposite side of the mall. Sarah groaned inwardly, not relishing the thought of walking all the way around though. But as she turned to head in that direction, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the distance, she could see a figure walking towards her. At first, she thought it was the same man who had chased her earlier, but as he got closer, she could see that it was someone else entirely. The figure was wearing a long, flowing robe that obscured his face. He walked slowly with a strange, almost hypnotic rhythm. Sarah couldn't take her eyes off of him as he approached, and she felt a strange, almost magnetic pull towards him. As he drew nearer, she could see that his eyes were black, with no discernible pupils or irises. It was very odd. She tried to turn and run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was rooted in the spot, unable to tear her gaze away from the figure. Finally, he stopped in front of her. Sarah could feel his breath on her face, and she realized with horror that he was not human at all. His skin was cold and clammy, and his breath smelled like death. "Come with me," he whispered. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound would come out. She was trapped, unable to move or even resist. The figure took her by the hand and started leading her towards the mall entrance. She could hear his footsteps echoing through the empty halls, and she realized with a sinking feeling that there was no escape. None at all. None at all. As they walked, Sarah could see that the mall was changing around her. The once familiar mall was now unrecognizable. The walls were covered in a thick layer of cobwebs, and the floors were very slick with an unknown substance. The stores that had once been full of life were now dark and empty, the windows all boarded up. Something I've never thought I'd ever see before. It was completely out of the ordinary. Sarah wanted to scream, but the figure's grip on her hand was too strong. She stumbled along behind him, her feet slipping on the slippery floors. She tried to pull away, but the figure seemed to be pulling her towards some unknown destination. As they turned a corner, Sarah saw a flash of movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned to look, but the figure pulled her back towards him. "Don't look," he hissed. But Sarah couldn't help herself. She turned and looked back, and what she saw made her heart stop. In the distance, she could see dozens of figures, all dressed in long robes, just like the figure was wearing. They were gathered around a large object, something that looked like an altar. Sarah could hear chanting and the sound of strange instruments being played. The figure started pulling her away again, but Sarah couldn't take her eyes off the scene. As they moved further away, she could see that the object on the altar was a large crystal, pulsing with an otherworldly light. The figures around it were all bowing down, worshipping it. Sarah wanted to run to escape this nightmare, but she was trapped, completely trapped. The figure led her through the mall down a hallway that seemed to go on forever. Finally, they arrived at a large set of double doors covered in strange symbols. The figure pushed the doors open, and Sarah stepped into a room that was even more terrifying than anything she had ever seen before. The walls were lined with cages, and inside each one was a person, their eyes empty and lifeless. The figure led her to a cage in the center of the room, and Sarah could see that it was empty, waiting for her, waiting only for her. She tried to fight back, but the figure was too strong. He pushed her into the cage and slammed the door shut. Sarah was trapped, alone in the darkness. She could hear the figure moving away from her, his footsteps echoing. She was terrified, not knowing what was going to happen to her. Hours passed, and Sarah lost track of time. She was hungry, thirsty, and scared. She tried to scream for help, but her voice was hoarse and absolutely not there, just from all the shouting she's done before. She could hear strange noises coming from outside her cage, the sound of chanting and whispering. There was so much going on, and she just couldn't take it. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the figure had returned. He opened the cage door and pulled Sarah out. She stumbled out, her legs weak from being trapped for so long. The figure led her down another hallway, and Sarah could see that they were now in a different part of the mall. The stores here were even more strange and unsettling, filled with objects that she couldn't really identify. They arrived at a large room filled with people dressed in robes like the figure. Sarah could see the crystal from before, pulsing with an otherworldly light. The figure led her to the center of the room, where a large circle had been drawn on the ground. The figures around her started chanting, their voices rising in a strange, hypnotic rhythm. Sarah could feel the energy in the room building, growing more and more intense with each passing moment. Suddenly, the crystal exploded in a burst of light, and Sarah felt herself being lifted off the ground. She was surrounded by a vortex of energy swirling around her, pulling her in every single direction imaginable. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, it was over. Sarah found herself standing outside the mall, the sun just starting to rise. She stumbled forward, disoriented and confused. She looked back at the mall, but it was gone. There was nothing but an empty lot where it had once stood. It was as if the mall had never been there. It's as though it never even existed. Sarah realized with horror that she had been caught up in some sort of supernatural ritual, and that the figures she had seen were not of this world. She didn't know what they had planned for her, or why they had let her go, or if she was even let go. She tried to forget about what had happened, to go on with her life as if nothing had changed, but the memories haunted her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that they were still out there somehow, somewhere, waiting for her. Years passed, and Sarah tried to forget about the mall and the figures she had seen there, but they were never far away from her thoughts. She had nightmares about them, waking up in cold sweat, screaming. And then one day, out of the blue, Sarah received a package in the mail. Inside was a small crystal pulsating with that otherworldly light she couldn't forget. There was no note, no explanation, but Sarah knew that it was from them. She tried to throw the crystal away, to forget about it, but it was like a magnet, drawing her back to that place, to the horror that she had once experienced. In the end, Sarah knew that she had to confront her fears to face the horror head on. She returned to the empty lot where the mall had once stood, clutching the crystal in her hand. As she stood there, she could feel the energy building up once again, the same energy that had surrounded her all those years ago. She knew that they were there, waiting for her. But this time Sarah was ready. She held the crystal up high, focusing all of her energy on it, and then with a burst of light, the figures appeared before her. Sarah didn't run. She didn't even scream. She stood her ground, facing them down with all the courage that she could muster, and then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. Banished back to whatever world they had come from. Sarah was left standing there alone in the empty lot, but she knew that she had conquered her fear, that she had faced the horror and come out on the other side. She knew that she would never forget what had happened to her in that mall, that she would carry the memory with her for the rest of her life.